William McCall from NTT Communications will share what we call network automation philosophy. William? The intent of this presentation is to provide you with some inspiration when you are automating parts of your network. What are things to take in consideration? Not necessarily what to type in what language, but from a philosophical point of view. William?
Yeah, thank you, Joe. And it's good to actually be back in Amsterdam. I think it's been 11 years since I've visited. And Joe somehow or another managed to force me to come out of my dark corner in the lab and come out and talk a little bit about some of the things I've been working on and some of the observations that I've had. It's kind of a repetition. My name is William McCall. I work with Joe over at NTT Gin, and really glad to be with you today to talk about a network automation philosophy. First, why philosophy? I think it was a little bit of a term that we used to describe exactly that I'm not interested in coming up with the various prescriptive adages that you could go and apply to network automation. I think that most people today have dabbled in automation at least to some extent, right? Raise your hand if you're doing at least some automation today. I don't even know why I'm doing the presentation, then you're already going to know where we're going with this, right? But I think it's still at least worth to go over a little bit of kind of what we've seen in the past. So, one of the big things that I've seen in network automation is that network automation is a big team building exercise for me. And more importantly, from the perspective of trying to be able to go into an environment or to be able to work in an environment and get those to be able to implement automation well, you have to be able to bring the people into the team. So I'll talk a little bit about how it functions in terms of team building. Next, a little bit into how architecture comes into play, because I think that we talk a lot about network architecture in one way, but at the same time, right, we're also having to then deal with, okay, and now I've got network, I've got software, and I need to go and glue those things together. It makes sense, right? It's nothing too crazy. Data models, of course, the core of what we're going to be dealing with in any automation. We want to go and take something and make it usable, so we're going to need to actually put it together for our nice computer. Tools are really important but unimportant. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the trends in tools that have particularly irked me, but have also been a benefit out for folks as well. Error handling, I think, is probably the most important part of automation. Is worth just reiterating. Please don't throw your script out there and hope that it works. Let's make sure that it's not going to blow up everything. And then I'll talk a little bit about measuring, not too much, because I think there's people who can much better speak to it, but at least as kind of a high-level overview. So, in terms of the team, right, let's just start by stating the obvious. We work with people, mostly anyway, right? I think that we all are working with people that we enjoy working with, and sometimes we even work well with people. But the thing is that when we're talking about automation, we have to think about who is the team that we're actually working with, right? Because a lot of times when we start into this process of, I want to go and make X, Y, or Z happen, right? We're thinking about, hey, this is my immediate itch I need to scratch. This is my immediate problem. But we're not oftentimes thinking about, hey, who is going to use this? We're not always thinking about what is the story behind how the end user is going to go and utilize this, who is going to be supporting it, and so on. A lot of times, when I've walked into places, I've been able to kind of go and grab the person who's been there the longest. And I had a really great experience over at my last job, a guy who I worked with there who had worked there for 15 years. And it's a great time to go and chat with him because he had kind of seen every little iteration that had moved through the network. he had had a chance to really get into what the motivations were behind various architects who had come and gone, right? Where they were trying to go with things. And in a lot of cases, I think what I found was that they had already started down this path of automation, much like most of the folks out here, right? At some point or another, it's at least started. And so in kind of being able to go and chat with the guys that I worked with at this particular place, we got a good idea of where we had an opportunity and where we had things in place already to go and implement automation. So, for example, just the way that our BGP policy is set up. We have our prefix list set up in a certain way. We have things set up that are organized appropriately so that we can go and just say, okay, I'm going to make this modification right here, and this is what we're going to focus on in terms of what we're going to change. But I also want to note, too, that I've spoken with other people, and some of the other people are not quite so keen on automation, and it's rather interesting in some of the rationale that they have, and I think it's worth, listening to what they have to say. While most of us are fairly convinced as to why we need it, some of the, concerns that I've run into is, in one example, they did some fairly heavy automation work at the beginning, but the engineer who ran the last script that killed off all their automation hopes and dreams ultimately was because they caused a massive, massive network outage, and the company in particular was a payment processing company. The problem is with payment processing companies, when the credit cards stop processing, nobody gets paid, and that's not going to work. In another case, I chatted with another guy, and he had, was really gung-ho about how he wanted to go and build out this greenfield network, and I said, great, this is an awesome time to go and be able to come straight into a network automation, and we won't have to, worry about all this legacy configuration that we have to go and do. We won't have to worry about strange architecture that we have to deal with. We can just hop into there. And he's, no, I don't want to get into that immediately. If we're going to do it, I want to work with wholly vendor tools. I was like, well, what about your specific requirements and so on? We chatted for a little while, and basically what his experience was that he had had a guy or two come in, go and write up some Perl scripts or however, much like we've seen back in the day, do their thing, get the business hooked on automation, but because they hadn't built a team quite, right, well, when that guy bailed, there went their automation. So the thing that I think that is the most important part, though, is that these folks are having a lot of experience, and they're bringing that to the table, but they've seen it in a particular environment or a particular setting, and much like we function, or someone might function in a sales role, a lot of times it ends up being a process of overcoming objection, right? And I don't mean that in like, I just want to go and like, hey, here's your problem, let me just go ahead and move on and try to just get past whatever your minor issue is. It's actually saying, how can you go and build it a little bit better to go and help relieve those problems. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, in a lot of cases, the team is going to include more people than you thought. So at my last job, I was working dealing with customer service reps who were actually going to be an integral part of the automation that we were doing. I worked in the DNS business, particularly on the registry side of the equation. And in the registry side, we had some very particular mechanisms that we had to put in place in order to ensure fairness for the registrars that were connecting. And that meant for us that we had to allow for these IP blocks to be updated in an appropriate time frame and so on and so forth. Well, I don't really want to go and handle that over the weekend. So I need to be able to make it where the customer service reps can go and use it appropriately, but also not turn it into something that is going to be just a single purpose tool. So working through that process of going and determining who all is going to use it was really important. And I wanted to mention on the last point is that everyone has an opinion and only some matter. And that's not to say that you ignore everybody's opinion, but it's true. There's something about the nature of network automation that I found is that when we start having the conversations with other teams, a lot of times they start coming up with great ideas of how we can go and utilize the network automation tooling that you're putting in place to solve other problems. And I think it makes sense. The problem domain for network automation often has overlap with other areas. But as I found, the more opinions that you take in for action against your automation platform, as you approach too many opinions, you start approaching re-implementing AWS. I don't think that's where I'm trying to go. Onward kind of into architecture, and I think this is, for everyone who's done this so far and is being the bulk of the audience, I think this makes sense. It's predominantly a process of mapping and abstracting. Supporting all of the router features is simply not going to work. And I mention this because in architecture, right, you can kind of just say, well, I'm breaking down problems, right? And I can make a diagram that will go and describe this problem and this solution. I can go and take a specific case and I can make it more generic. And there's several different ways, obviously, to go and work around this. But I think about one in particular case that I had, which was a very oddball policy-based routing. Now, a lot of people will say, well, you can use VRFs to go and solve that situation. But in this case, it was very, very simple to use policy-based routing, and VRFs would have been totally complicated. But as we're working through the process now of saying, hey, I want to go and do this automation, right? How can I go and make this a little bit easier? Because if I draw out policy-based routing with just a regular routing diagram, it looks totally crazy, right? We start saying, like, okay, fine, I've got like 5 IPs going like this over here, I've got 4 over here. I've not bothered to go through the process yet of doing the grouping to go and make it make more sense and to go and point at, hey, this is what I'm actually trying to go and put together as the architecture behind what we're doing. So from my perspective, my objective in going and looking at architecture is not simply to say like, hey, now I have defined a network. I've now also defined how it's going to function with respect to the automation portion that comes into play. From sustainability perspective, I think I mentioned a little bit earlier is that we had that situation where we had the one guy who was working on the code, and that's not particularly sustainable. But there's other things to consider as well, right? Because we've got, let's say for example, we've got our users involved, we've got our network engineers, right? We may potentially have a separate software development team that's working on this, and we may have operations teams who could be on both the software side and also on the network side. So from sustainability perspective, it becomes something where we have to be able to develop those roles and determine how they're going to go and function. With some basic automation, right, I think for introductory stuff, most of those roles are going to be satisfied probably by the networking team, right? I don't think that I would want to hand off to my ops guys immediately, hey, I've just made this awesome new platform, go and support it, and when it blows up, well, just sort it out, we'll be fine, right? And call me if you need oh, by the way, I'm also going on vacation next week. So in my thought about this, I want to make sure that when we're architecting, that we start thinking about the whole of the sustainability of how the life cycle is going to function and who all is going to be supporting it in the long run. If it's not there and you're not feeling like, hey, I want to be able to answer that weekend call for this platform that I'm building, that's probably not going to work out very well for you. From a usability perspective, it's pretty straightforward, I think, to think about usability in that, hey, I created a nice little web UI, cool, that's usable, right? But also to considering things like how you're going to be able to debug these tools, right? So if we've got somebody from customer service utilizing the tool, right, and now then they're going to result in an ACL push or whatever the case may be, it's important that they understand like when this actually goes through, that they can see the big green checkbox. This is now done and it's been pushed out to the devices, especially if you have like, if you're going to aggregate those changes for later, receiving emails, things like that. So this usability is really important. And it's not always in the most straightforward ways that you're thinking of. That's kind of the big thing that I wanted to go and emphasize. But obviously the magic trick is that we have to do this with the network and software side by side. So as we're kind of beating our heads against the desk about network issues, we've also got to beat our heads against the desk about software issues. Data models are, well, they're straightforward. You've started in with your architecture already done, a substantial amount of abstracting and mapping. Now it's time to go and put this into code. If you've done your architecture well, hopefully it will translate very well into code because you would have nominally been thinking about the fact that you're going to put this into software. But the main thing that I wanted to go and note, aside from the architectural portion, is that the devices matter, right? Because in a lot of cases, and I promised myself I wouldn't do this, but I have to beat up on Cisco iOS in particular for automation. It is painful sometimes to have to deal with this incremental automation piece in iOS as an example, right? We might like something like XR or Junos to be able to go and do full config pushes. But obviously, if we have iOS in the network and that's our bread and butter, then we've got to adapt for that as well. And our data models have to adapt for that in particular. But from a mapping perspective, I just want to point out that if you haven't done it and sat down and done it yourself, for those who haven't, I will say that it is honestly quite boring, and it is very, very, very important. Because later on, as you begin to rely more and more on the data that you've collected to perform the automation, right? If you haven't structured it appropriately, it's going to be more work that you have to do. And as the larger that your automation gets, the more that you're going to have to deal with this. From indirection and duplication, like I think the adage is right, like almost any problem in computer science can be solved with indirection. And I think the second part is that duplication can also save you, and that's kind of a weird thing. So when I talked a little bit earlier about the customer service facing portion, I don't really want them interacting or being so tightly coupled to what I'm doing right this second in my automation platform. So what I did in this particular case is that I set them up with a portal that's kind of off to the side, right? It interacts via API over to my main automation platform, but what it allowed for me to do is to give them something that's quite separate. And so if we did just completely decide to go and nuke the main automation platform because, I don't know, management just got sick of it for whatever, or they wanted to go and rebuild it on some vendor-specific platform or however, we were able to go and do that and go and keep their stuff up and running. And let's say that even if it was just to send me an email to go and actually perform these changes, no problem. We can just go and make that happen, and it's completely transparent to them. In free-form injection, with respect to configuration changes, will save you. At some point, the boss is going to come to you and say, I want this thing done. It really doesn't conform with the automation that you have. As a matter of fact, your automation is probably a little bit in the way of what I'm asking you to do. So putting that in up front into your data models really will go and make your life a lot easier. So I'm glad to actually talk about tools, and I think that between tools and error handling, I probably could have done a completely different presentation and perhaps of more interest to some people than this kind of philosophical thing. But I didn't want to talk about any particular tools because I felt like it would just turn into like the minute of hate, especially about some tools that have just blown my mind into the insanity that gets pushed by out in the field. But a couple of things that I've observed about choosing tools. One is that I've seen a lot of hand-waving by people who are newer into the business of doing automation. So, example, I had this one guy who was working on doing some DMVPN deployment, and he needed to go and push certificates out to these devices. They're production devices, and he said he wanted to use tool X, right? And I said, okay, cool, let me take a look and see how that's going to work from this. Well, DMVPN, standard iOS stuff, so we know it's going to be incremental config. Now, how exactly is that going to go and play out? Well, this tool really doesn't have any mechanism to catch errors at config time. That's kind of a problem, especially on a production device, right? Because sometimes those errors that are coming back at you are important. And even worse is that not only did it not have a mechanism to detect errors, it didn't even have a mechanism for you to come back and see if there were errors. So it was more or less, here's some lines of config, let's hope it works. So as I kind of chatted with him a little bit, he said, well, let's see, I can maybe turn this into like a pre-deployment provisioning thing, and then it won't be on the production devices. We'll do it on a pre-deployment basis. And I thought about it, and I said, well, in that case, okay, but you're going to need to check all that stuff by hand. He said, well, okay, I'm fine with that. Or you can write a script to go and do it. Fine, I don't care. He said, I'm fine with that. I'll go check it by hand, validate that everything's good, and get to where I need to go. So hand-waving away the fact that this tool could not go and handle these configurers, that was a major thing. And there's several other deficiencies that you can find in the tools when you go looking, and you have to check to see if it matters for your situation. If it doesn't matter for your situation, by all means, go for it. It's awesome to be able to use something that you don't have to spend all the time to write. From a problem space perspective, some of the problems that you're going to run into potentially are just not solved. I mean, I know that it's sort of the old adage is just all the problems have been solved at some point or another. Come to find out, they haven't. And at some point, you're going to end up spending time trying to go and figure out how you're going to solve that for your own situation. And it's probably going to involve writing, a substantial amount of code to make your own tools. And it is what it is. So in particular, I had to operate on this one device that has a really bad API. That's about the only way to control it. There was a CLI, but it was even worse than the API, far worse. And even when I talked with the vendor about it, they were like, oh, we have an API? Yeah, okay. This is probably not going to work out very well. Anyway, we plowed through it. We got it to go and work. But it was understanding that they hadn't even really particularly thought about it, even though they had implemented it. And so some of this stuff is just not going to be there for you, not off the shelf. Also, template whitespace is a really big pain. And I know that this seems really basic to go and mention, but example, if you are doing full config generation, sometimes it can be a little bit particular about whitespace, and your favorite tool sometimes is just not going to want to work with you exactly. I mean, it makes sense to me. If we're working in HTML land, the whitespace is not so important. We add a couple extra spaces here and there. It's not going to be so upset about it. If we're pushing a full config over to iOS XR, that is not the case. It will be quite particular about how your white spacing works, and will be a little bit grumpy if you don't keep that exactly in line. And libraryization, it just really does make life easier, because sooner or later, you're going to want to be able to make a one-off script. You're going to want to be able to make a one-off script that's going to be useful against your existing data models. And you're really not going to want to have to spend all day trying to figure out how to go and get those data models to go and work just the way they're supposed to again and re-implement all of that. Or perhaps you've got your junior engineer who wants to go and do some stuff, and they don't really want to spend all day doing that. So between testing and the ability to go and prototype and make one-off scripts, I think that libraryization just in general will go and make your life easier. From error handling perspective, this is really something that is just absolutely my favorite topic. I've spent so much time trying to go and figure out why stuff is broken in subtle ways, especially on the input side of the equation, because users continue to confound me. Why is it that you thought that a /64 would go and work for an IPv4 address? I don't know, but it happens, right? And so we think of oftentimes that this stuff is very obvious, that no, they could never go and get it wrong. But on the other side of the equation too is that when we're talking about users, that's a human element, but also consider too when you're doing things like screen scraping, right? Is that that's a form of input if it's feeding into your automation. And in a lot of cases, you're just going to find that, like anyone who's done screen scraping, that line decided to go and break right here for no real reason. And now all of a sudden my screen scraping's not working and I'm just not getting the results of what I'm looking for. Also considering as well an output validation and auditing. I think that this is, again, something very, very basic, but something that you can take this as far as you want or as simple as you want. From output validation perspective, I've seen situations where we take a config, it's a valid config, it doesn't throw errors, and it just never shows up. Why? bug X, Y, or Z on the device, or it just happens to be the third Sunday of the 5th month, and however it ends up going and working out. But my favorite way, ultimately, when I'm just doing output validation, I just want to go and get something very basic to run, is just check the diff, right? If we've got somebody checking the diff prior to it getting deployed, and then checking the diff after, or whatever the case may be for the specific mechanism that you're using for automation, right? If you're wanting to go and use API-based stuff, same concept, right? Having a little bit of time to go back and validate that, and making sure as well that your data models are up to date. So in the same vein for auditing. From the device perspective, I mentioned earlier as well about the configuration will just throw errors. And in a lot of cases, the tools, if you haven't thought about how many different ways an error can be thrown in configuration, sometimes it's a little bit mind-boggling, because the same way that they throw an error can just be the same way they throw an informational message if you're doing through CLI-based automation. So it's something to go and keep in mind, that the devices themselves will oftentimes error out, and also to think about things like, hey, it just timed out hitting SSH, now what are we going to do, right? Do we bail out? If we've already put this into here and there's an expectation that it's going to get done, do we retry it? How often do we retry it? And when do we decide to go and work through things? From tracing perspective, as you've written your automation, the ability to look back and see what exactly it did is going to be really, really important when stuff breaks. That also means, too, that simplicity in your automation will help you, because there's only so many places that you can add another printf or debugs line, right, and be able to go and get that back out to you and make that usable. As you add more tracing, the more useless it gets, and I get reminded of this frequently when we have to call vendor X, Y, or Z's TAC. And then finally, in failure domains, I wanted to mention this because in a lot of cases, you build your automation platforms around taking care of the entire network. Sometimes that doesn't make sense. So if I'm running, as an example, redundant data centers for a service, I probably don't want the same setup going and running both of them, because it can be really, really problematic if I'm making a change into both of them that now, let's say it's a global change, and now it's going to go and hit both of my super business critical setup. That's not really going to work. So by going and keeping a little bit of separation and kind of keeping an idea of what the failure domains are going to look like, just like we would do anywhere else in network land, it can go and really go a long way to going and keeping the network functioning appropriately, and also keeping you off those fun late night calls. So I think that covered quite a few items in this. From the measurement perspective, I don't want to talk a lot about how measurement can feed back into automation proper. I think that other people are much better at discussing that than I am. But I do want to talk a little bit just about automation time trade-off. Sometimes you're going to have the one-off thing. Do it when you need to do it, right? Don't waste a lot of time trying to go and build the next Picasso of network automation if it's simply not going to pan out to be of any meaningful use. Get your job done and get on with life, right? It'll make you happier in the long run. And from operational performance perspective, if you're going to architect a network, you have an idea of what you want it to do. Similarly, when you architect automation, you have an idea of what you want it to do, and you have an idea of kind of what the timings are behind it. Example, if I need something to happen within 15 minutes, it needs to happen within 15 minutes. And if it's not happening within 15 minutes, then that's a problem. Similarly, if we are expecting that this is going to reduce the time to resolution because of whatever particular scenario that you're running into, in my other case, I needed to update the customer ACLs within, let's say, 72 hours, and that's not actually helping to get the customer ACLs updated within 72 hours, then we need to go back and evaluate, hey, what are we doing wrong? Cool, basic stuff. But I think that more importantly than all of that is satisfaction for doing more with less. I don't want to implement automation that's going to make me feel worse about operating my network than I felt before. Because then at that point, I've just really made a nightmare for myself. Now I've got extra complexity for almost no satisfaction. And I want this to be, at least for me, an experience where I go in and I say, you know what, cool. I can just go and do 100 of these changes right now. I'll blast right through it, no problem. And when I'm done with it, I start saying, I feel like I really got something done by doing this, by going and changing it from doing this manually, by going and changing this from taking an excessive amount of time and now making it into something that I can do rather quickly. That's all I have for you today. Take questions.
Jeff Haas from Juniper. One observation from your slides, you're talking about building effectively its components. And one of the things that has been sort of a problem with tooling, from vendors over the years is there's no one single toolkit that tends to hit all platforms or even all layers of a platform. It becomes really important that the low-level piece that actually does a specific job needs to be encapsulated, needs to be covered as a functional component for that subsystem. That way, for example, if you're on a Junos box and you can do all this stuff through XML RPC down at this one specific place, it's a component, your higher levels can drive it at that point. Whereas if you actually try to do too much of that logic too far out, you end up with this spaghetti code of coding of functional components trying to actually do everything all in a big switch statement or something like that.
Yeah, exactly right. And we ran into this before as well, and I would say that being able to componentize on a per-device basis is one layer of the abstraction, right? And then working your way up over into describing things like services, right? That's how you kind of be able to work your way up to being able to express things not just in terms of, hey, I've got a device that's a switch, I've got a device that's a router. It's working your way up to call it in terms of services or call it in terms of this component that is more usable for the customer service yahoos or however the case may be.
And so this is where I put in my IETF plug of, for those of you who care about this sort of thing, and also, unfortunately, data layers, please take a look at IETF work that's working on data models inside of Yang for individual protocols and components. That's where a lot of the stuff hopefully will end up over time. It's not there yet.
Indeed.
All right, thank you, William.